The doors of the gym opened, and 5 black belts stepped forward, each confident, each certain they knew the man before them. Bruce Lee stood alone, silent, his expression unreadable. The crowd held its breath. 8 seconds later, every challenger had stopped moving. Not from injury alone, but from a realization that passed through the room in an almost imperceptible silence. The air shifted. What had happened was decisive, inevitably final, and yet no one could explain exactly how it unfolded. The gym was quiet, its walls lined with mirrors that reflected not just bodies, but intentions. A few sparse windows let in light, fractured and pale, cutting across the wooden floor. The scent of sweat hung lightly, mingling with the faint aroma of varnish. It was not the kind of place meant for spectacle. It was a place where skill was measured, silently, in repetition and presence rather than applause. Bruce Lee arrived before the challengers, his movements deliberate and unhurried. He began a brief, private warm-up, stretching, a few slow shadow punches, but even these motions seemed to belong more to the space than to him. The black belts would later describe the effect. He moved as if the room itself had acknowledged him, as if his body alone could quiet it. Outside the ring, the challengers' reputations preceded them. Each held a black belt in a different discipline. Each had victories and titles that drew attention in martial arts circles. To the onlookers, this was supposed to be a test of strength and skill. Yet when the 5 men stepped inside, there was an immediate sense of imbalance, a subtle weight that shifted in Bruce's favor without a single contact. Witnesses recall the stillness before the challenge was announced. The crowd, composed mostly of local practitioners and a handful of students, leaned forward instinctively. Conversation died to near silence. Even the black belts, confident in their own abilities, hesitated for the first time. The room's rhythm slowed, not from fear, but from an awareness that what was about to occur would not be ordinary. Then came the challenge itself. No loud declarations, no dramatic gestures. A single statement, precise and measured. Bruce acknowledged it with a simple nod. That nod alone drew a line in the air between expectation and inevitability. Time seemed to stretch. Every second counted, yet moved imperceptibly. By the time the challengers assumed their stances, the room had transformed. The mirrors reflected more than form. They reflected anticipation, curiosity, and a quiet tension that hovered like a living thing. This was not about proving oneself against Bruce Lee. It was about entering the space of someone whose mastery was already spoken for by the absence of noise. In that moment, the challenge had begun without a sound. The black belts stepped forward, each measuring the space between themselves and Bruce. They adjusted stances subtly, wrists flexing, feet grounding. Every movement was deliberate, a rehearsal of confidence, but none disrupted the quiet that hung over the room. Bruce did not move to meet them. He simply observed, his gaze calm, unshaken. There was no announcement, no challenge issued in volume. The authority in the room was not declared. It existed, silently, carried by Bruce's presence. Witnesses would later describe it as a tension that could be felt in the shoulders, in the way the black belts shifted their weight, in the barely audible intake of breath from the spectators. Each challenger extended a hand, offered a nod, a small acknowledgement of protocol. Bruce responded with the same restraint. A single nod, a measured blink, the faintest exhale. The simplicity of these gestures contrasted sharply with the weight they carried. In that quiet exchange, Bruce established a boundary. Control was conveyed not by force, but by stillness and awareness. The challengers tested him briefly with subtle movements. Feints, a quick step forward, a probing glance. Each was an attempt to assert dominance, to break the calm. Yet with every motion, Bruce adapted in the smallest, almost invisible ways. A tilt of the head, a shift in stance, a slight repositioning of the shoulders. No strike, no overt engagement, just presence. By the time the public fully registered the interplay, it was clear. The confrontation had shifted from a question of strength to a question of perception. The black belts were no longer performing against Bruce. They were performing against the certainty in the room itself. Their confidence, normally absolute, wavered, not through fear, but through recognition of mastery that needed no demonstration. The crowd leaned forward in unison, sensing the subtle hierarchy forming before them. Not a hierarchy of rank or title, but of control. Bruce did not dominate them with action. He dominated the room with clarity. The gym itself seemed to defer to his rhythm, as if acknowledging that the true measure of authority was quiet, deliberate, and unassailable. And yet, despite the growing tension, no move had been made. The air remained taut, anticipatory. The confrontation existed entirely in observation, in the silent dialogue between intent and awareness. A low murmur ran through the spectators, almost imperceptible at first. Conversations halted mid-word. Eyes shifted from Bruce to the challengers, back again, as if trying to locate the moment where the balance of control would finally tip. There was no rush, no frantic energy. The tension grew slowly, a pressure that settled into every corner of the room. The black belts moved with caution now, testing subtle distances, each step deliberate. Their usual confidence seemed tempered by the awareness that Bruce's calm was not a prelude. It was the space itself responding to him. One of the challengers flexed his fingers, another adjusted his stance. Yet every attempt at assertion felt measured, almost ceremonial. They were aware of the spectator's gaze, of the historical weight of the encounter. Witnesses later described how time felt different in those moments. 8 seconds stretched into infinity. Each second allowed the audience to absorb details. The way Bruce's eyes tracked without strain, the slight contraction of muscles in anticipation, the tiny shifts that carried a quiet authority. Nothing was wasted. Every small motion carried significance, a lesson absorbed subconsciously by those who watched. Some spectators held their breath, realizing that the outcome might already be written, not through confrontation, but through perception. The challenger's confidence, once solid, showed fissures. Subtle gestures betrayed hesitation. A foot tapped too lightly, a hand drifted mid-stance, a gaze lingered longer than intended. Each observer sensed the quiet unraveling of certainty before a single strike had landed. Bruce remained motionless beyond the minimal adjustments necessary to maintain balance. In his stillness, there was an inevitability that the crowd could feel but not articulate. The room, previously a neutral space, had shifted subtly, imperceptibly, into his domain. Silence deepened, heavy and expectant. Yet it carried no threat. The silence demanded attention, reflection, and surrender to what was unfolding. Even the challengers were affected. Their eyes flicked toward one another, unspoken communication passing between them. A recognition of a boundary they had not anticipated. The challenge had begun in words and posture, but the real contest existed entirely in the perception of control. It was a slow, almost imperceptible collapse. Not of bodies, but of certainty. By the time the next second passed, the audience understood. They were witnessing something beyond skill. They were witnessing clarity, presence, and mastery distilled into action, or, in Bruce's case, near inaction. The tension was no longer rising. It had reached a quiet apex. All that remained was demonstration. Then it happened. 8 seconds, no more, no less. Bruce shifted, a movement so small that most spectators at first did not register it. A subtle adjustment of his stance, the faint pivot of a foot, the near imperceptible tensing of muscles. Yet in that instant, every black belt reacted. Not with strikes, not with counters, but with immediate recalibration. Their confidence faltered, replaced by recognition. The demonstration was economical, precise. Each gesture served a purpose. A step to one side, a redirection of energy, a deflection that required no contact. In the echoes of those motions, the challengers' intentions were revealed and neutralized before they could fully materialize. It was not force that dominated the space, it was clarity. Every action was deliberate. Every inaction was equally measured. Witnesses would later struggle to describe it. One recounted seeing a hand extend toward Bruce, only to halt midair, frozen by the certainty of response before any contact occurred. Another remembered a slight twitch of an arm that seemed almost irrelevant, yet carried the weight of impossibility. The black belts' faces changed subtly, eyes widening, brows tightening, breaths catching. Control had shifted silently, entirely. Bruce's mastery was not loud. There were no cries, no dramatic sweeps, no exaggerated displays. The economy of motion carried authority beyond what the challenger's training could counter. Every strike that could have been made was already rendered ineffective in anticipation. The room's energy shifted around him. Space itself seemed to acknowledge his presence, bending not through force, but through inevitability. By the 8th second, the room was still. The black belts were no longer poised to attack. They were simply frozen in observation. The air was heavy with a new understanding. Spectators felt it in their chests, a quiet pressure that settled without explanation. This was mastery rendered minimal yet absolute. Bruce took a single step back, neutral, unhurried. No one moved. The silence was not empty. It was full of recognition. The challenge, though begun in tension, had already concluded. Not with a struggle of strength, but with the clarity of presence, precision, and inevitability. The silence did not immediately break. The black belts remained in place, frozen in their stances, yet their posture had changed. Shoulders sagged slightly. Eyes darted, searching for something. An error, a flaw, any foothold, but found none. What had happened was not a physical defeat. It was a moment of comprehension, silent and absolute. Witnesses later described an almost imperceptible hesitation in the challenger's breathing, a pause that spoke louder than any groan or cry. They had entered the gym expecting a test of skill, yet were confronted instead with inevitability. Their confidence, meticulously built over years, was quietly dismantled in seconds. Not by injury, not by threat, but by clarity and control. The room itself seemed to expand and contract with the weight of realization. Students and observers remained still, aware that the demonstration had altered the dynamics of authority. The black belts shifted subtly, a collective acknowledgement that the contest had ended. They were not beaten in the conventional sense. They were rendered still by understanding. Some moved first, small steps backward, tentative, almost reverential. Others remained in place, still absorbing the implications. No one spoke of victory or loss. No one raised a hand to challenge further. The defeat was psychological, yet its impact was absolute. It left an imprint visible in posture, in gaze, in the quiet withdrawal of confidence. Bruce, meanwhile, remained composed. No triumph was expressed. No words were exchanged. His restraint emphasized the finality of the demonstration. There was no need to claim victory. The lesson had been communicated silently, through motion, presence, and perception. By the time the murmurs began among the spectators, the black belts had stepped away, regrouping, their expressions subdued. The room exhaled collectively, as if the air itself had been held in anticipation and then released. What had occurred was not a display of dominance for spectacle. It was a recalibration of understanding, a quiet but indelible mark on everyone who had witnessed it. The psychological collapse was complete. The challengers had faced mastery, not through aggression, but through inevitability and control. The lesson would resonate long after the room emptied, carried in memory and reflected in every retelling. Years later, those who had been present in that gym would recount the incident with a quiet reverence. The black belts, once confident and unshakable, spoke of that 8-second interval not as a defeat, but as an encounter that redefined their understanding of mastery. They remembered the stillness, the precision, the inevitability, and how little action was required to assert absolute control. Bruce Lee's demonstration became more than a story of a challenge met. It became a lesson in restraint. Students and observers described how the room had seemed to bend around him, how every movement, however small, had carried weight far beyond its physical presence. In later years, martial artists from distant cities would seek out those witnesses, asking them to recount what they had seen. Each retelling added subtle detail, each emphasizing the quiet authority that had left an indelible mark on the participants and the spectators alike. The challengers themselves carried the memory differently. Some spoke of it privately, reflecting on their own training, their assumptions about confrontation, and the nature of control. None of them doubted what had occurred. It was not the act of striking, but the act of commanding presence, that remained vivid. In their recollections, Bruce's movements were still, deliberate, minimal, yet impossibly precise. They spoke of it almost as a natural law, a force that did not need to be tested again. Over time, the gym itself became symbolic, not for the titles held within it, nor the victories recorded on its walls, but for that singular moment when silence conveyed more than action could. Students who had not been present would hear of the story, internalizing the lesson without witnessing it directly. The incident was passed down in whispers, in training halls, in quiet moments of reflection before practice, becoming a legend of authority, efficiency, and psychological clarity. Bruce's legacy in that room and beyond was cemented not by the number of opponents he faced, but by the subtlety of how he faced them. The story endured because it was minimal, deliberate, and undeniable. It was never a tale of boastful triumph, only of inevitability realized. And so the room remained silent in memory, a quiet testament to mastery, teaching, influencing, and resonating long after the echoes of that day had faded. Those 8 seconds, though brief, shaped understanding in a way that action alone never could. The legend of what occurred did not require embellishment. The truth of presence, control, and efficiency spoke for itself.